with silky polish his readers expect of him. In A Rude Life, he turns his dispassionate observer's gaze on himself and in taut prose tells us about all that he's experienced and nothing more. Or he's still a private man. He unhurriedly recounts memories from his childhood and college years, moving on to give us an understanding of how he wrote his biggest stories while giving us an insider's view into the politics and glamour of that time. I'm sure we are all looking forward to hearing a few inside stories from Vir Sanghvi. Now, may I request Shanti Perez to introduce the book.
Thanks, Vinita.
You're welcome, Shanti.
With the release of his latest book, A Rude Life, the memoir, which has become the talk of the town, Vir Sanghvi now feels he has done it all and is ready to hang up his boots. Or so he said. It's a highly entertaining book that showcases one of the most eventful careers in Indian journalism. It is a study of the changing landscape of politics and the press. It contains unpublished anecdotes from conversations with national leaders, sprinkled with a cast of colorful personalities like Morarji Desai, Amitabh Bachchan, Dhirubhai Ambani, and a host of other prominent political and cultural figures. A Rude Life is a delectable read. Now, may I request Vinita Bert Dsa to introduce the author of the session, Mr. Vir Sanghvi.
Thank you, Shanti. Thank you, Shanti. Vir Sanghvi needs no introduction. Nevertheless, I have been given the privilege to introduce Vir Sanghvi to our Catholic Club audience. So good morning to all, and here we go. Vir Sanghvi is an Indian editor and a television personality. Born on July 5th in London and brought up in Mumbai, he did his schooling at the Mid Hill School, London, and his college at the Mayo College, Ajmer. He further studied politics, philosophy, economics, and philosophy at the Brasenose College, Oxford, UK. He was the editor of Hindustan Times, and his television career has included award-winning shows on Star TV, NDTV, Discovery, and other channels. He also has a parallel career in India's leading food and travel industry. His show Custom Made for Vir Sanghvi, hosted by NDTV Good Times, in which he travels around India in the most luxurious and bespoke experiences. He also is the co-founder of Easy Diner. Vir Sanghvi has authorized many books: Men of Steel, Rude Food, India Then and Now, The Attack on Mumbai 2611, and A Life, a book on Madhav Rao's Scindia. And of course, the latest book, which we are all looking for, A Rude Life. Thank you. Over to Samira.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today, as you all know, we have a very noted author with us. Vir Sanghvi, as you all know, is one of India's best editors, and he has a very unique insider view, not just of political circles, but the film industry, the world of food, entertainment, and so much more. I had the opportunity to go through his book yesterday, and for me, it reflects a story not just about his life, but a story of India as well. It's really an honest retelling of our country, what has changed, what has not changed, and what we all should be aware of. As someone who has written about, interviewed, and interacted behind the scenes with India's movers and shakers, right from politicals to showbiz, pop culture to contemporary events, there's so much about Vir that we can learn about and go ahead with today. So congratulations, Vir, on the book. Absolutely a delightful read. And once again, welcome to Catholic Club. I recall that you mentioned somewhere, and I quote, if there was no lockdown, there would have been no book either. Would that have really been the case? Sorry, we can't hear you. Yeah, if you can unmute.
Okay, so can you hear me now?
Perfect. Go ahead.
So let me first of all say thank you for inviting me, and hello to everyone watching this in the morning. It's very kind of you. In answer to your question, yeah, that's true. I'd always wondered whether I would write a memoir, and had always decided against it. And then the lockdown happened, not the later lockdowns, but the first lockdown when you really couldn't go out and couldn't do anything. And I was stuck at home, frustrated with nothing to do. And it seemed to me that maybe this was a good opportunity to try and do something useful. And a book seemed like the easiest thing to do. But if I was going to do a book, what were they going to write about? There was nothing happening. I didn't have access to anyone. I couldn't go out. So I wrote about the only subject I really know, and that's myself. So I sat down and I wrote one chapter every day. And there are 61 chapters. So I did it for about a little more than 2 months, because I didn't necessarily write on Sundays or whatever. But in less than 3 months, the book was done. So you're right. No lockdown, no sitting at home, no book.
Wonderful. You've earned the reputation of featuring some of the major news stories for the last 4.5 decades. Although I know it's quite difficult to choose for you, which one of them is really a feather in your cap?
Frankly, none really. I mean, I'm not the sort of chap who looks back and enumerates his achievements. If you read the book, I've tried very hard not to be boastful and say, I broke this story or I did this interview. I mean, life is ultimately a river. You just go with the flow.
I think those are great insights. And your book has been characteristically titled A Rude Life. But what we know about you is, you are overly kind, you're honest, you're more truthful when it comes to reporting, also based on your background and experience. Can you just give us an insider view, or insider view as to why is this book titled A Rude Life?
Well, the honest answer is it's not my title. My wife and I thought of many, many titles, and then Penguin suggested some titles. And they didn't like the titles we thought of, and I didn't like the titles they had thought of. And then finally, I think somebody in Penguin marketing suggested A Rude Life, partly because I do a column called Rude Food and Rude Travel, and partly because they thought the tone of the book, if not rude, was irreverent. It was quite a breezy sort of book. It wasn't overly reverential to anyone. And they said, that'll sum it up. And so by then, I'd given up thinking of names. So I was very relieved to accept their suggestion.
I think that's a very catchy title to start with, because it really draws our attention to see what is written in the book when we know that, when we know so much more about you and your family and your background at the same time. So to all the journalists and media who are also with us, I just want to ask you, how does a journalist decide what can be shared and what is deemed confidential? And how have you managed to strike the balance in your book?
It's a difficult decision, because usually when people talk to you, they make it clear what's on the record and what's off the record. So that part is easy. But often you discover things not necessarily in a journalistic context, and you have to then decide, do you put them out in the public domain? Say, let me give you an example. I am at somebody's house for an interview. The interview is over, and I see two people waiting in another room to meet him. And I know that these are people from another party. So I wonder now, is he negotiating to join that party? Is something happening behind the scenes? Now, he's not asked me to see these people. I'm being nosy and I'm being intrusive, and I'm noticing this. It isn't part of the on-the-record interview. So do you use it? Do you say, I saw somebody, I think he's therefore going to defect or join another party? In my case, the answer is nearly always yes, because you're there as a journalist, you're not there as his friend. So whatever you see in your journalistic capacity, it is your duty to report. You are nobody to play God and say, this bit I'll report and that bit my readers don't deserve to know. You report what you see.
I think well said. And, I just want to move on now, digress a bit to the political front.
Okay.
And, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, initially you described him as funny, accessible, open, but now he happens to be this imperial figure. So, what are your views on the transition of his attitude, behavior, and, the image that he puts on the forefront?
Okay, you see, I knew him when he was in Delhi. He was the general secretary of the party. He'd been a hardcore RSS worker from an early age, but he had no political or no, let's say, ministerial authority, nothing really. So he was therefore relaxed, he was easy. He went to Gujarat, he became chief minister. As we all know, many things happened to him while he was in Gujarat, and many things happened to Gujarat while he was there. But something changed during that period when he returned to Delhi, and he returned in triumph as prime minister. He was a very different person. He was very mistrustful of the press. He did not take criticism in quite the same spirit he did earlier. And whereas once upon a time, he'd been jokey and friendly. I did a show with him many years ago where Jairam Ramesh of the Congress was there. And he and Jairam had this whole jokey session about him asking Jairam to join the BJP and Jairam laughing about the BJP. That Modi has vanished, or if he does exist, he's available only to a few close friends. His public persona is that of the great leader who does no wrong, can do no wrong, who can never be questioned. It's not unusual to have this kind of persona. Mao Zedong had it, for instance, but it certainly does not accord with the Modi I used to know. So perhaps his personality has changed, or perhaps this is just a front he puts on to appeal to his followers as the great leader.
While we go to reputation, I also want to speak to you about communication, because I think that's also, quite integral. The Prime Minister had established a new model of communication which stressed on more of the social media and, new age journalism. How do you feel the Prime Minister balanced his relationship with the media?
I don't believe the Prime Minister has a relationship with the media. He believes and they rely on social media, they rely on Facebook. A lot of his election publicity, and one reason why he won the election was because they used Facebook very efficiently. He relies on WhatsApp. Many people in India, we have a new middle class. It's a middle class that came to prosperity within the last 15 years. It's not like the traditional middle class in that it didn't grow up in homes where people read newspapers or watched television news or whatever. So these people often get the news from the phone, and they get it from WhatsApp forwards. The BJP are masters of WhatsApp forwards. They will say everything possible on WhatsApp. And these are people who have no way of double checking it. So they will believe what is in WhatsApp. So if you want to communicate through Facebook, through WhatsApp, it's a medium where these are media where you're never ever going to be questioned. You can say what you like. If on the other hand, you do a press conference, you will be asked awkward questions. People contradictory. So why should somebody like Mr. Modi bother with the media who dare to answer back when he can say this without ever being asked a question?
So true. And let's move back, to decades when it was the time of the emergency. You began working as a journalist in 1976, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
And,
that's right.
yeah, and I think that's when the emergency was on. For all of us, who aren't aware of certain things that happened during that time, what are your early memories of that time as a journalist, Veer?
I became a journalist in 1976, and I was too young to do political reporting. I was 19. And at that stage, nobody would have allowed me to write a political story, which is probably just as well because we couldn't have written political stories. In the emergency, for those of you who are probably too young to remember, it began with press censorship, in that everything you wrote, editorials, news stories, had to go to a censor. The censor looked at it, approved of it, and only then could you print it. Very often the censor said he didn't approve of it. So often newspapers turned up because as a measure of protest with blank spaces on their pages to indicate that the content had been censored. But as we've seen in India now, you only need to wield the whip for a couple of months. After that, people fall in line. And then after a while, they didn't have to do any censorship. They didn't have to arrest any more journalists. People just stored the line. They did whatever the government wanted. They censored themselves. They did pieces that flattered the government because they wanted to keep in with the government. As Mr. Advani said famously of the press during that period, asked to bend, they crawled. So, I mean, all of this was a pretty terrible phase for the press. It was okay for me because I was doing it as a teenager. I had no real political experience. The kind of stuff I did was business, films, light stuff. So it didn't worry me a great deal. Unfortunately, by the time I became a proper journalist and had a full-time job, the emergency was over.
Okay. And I think you're one of the fortunate ones who happened to be around Indira Gandhi. And I think, you witnessed her for over 6 years after you became a journalist. What are your early impressions of her? We know her as being strong, took a lot of abuse and bounced back. I recall you mentioning somewhere in your book that she used to walk past pictures of her family and feel a sense of shame. She felt she had to do something about it. What did she do to make India shine?
Okay, the story about walking past pictures of family is actually Sonia Gandhi. But in answer to your question about Indira Gandhi, I think Mrs. Gandhi was a very strong leader. I don't think you can dispute many of Mrs. Gandhi's great qualities, one of which was she saw India as being one. Until she won that huge victory in 1971, Indian elections had always been fought on the basis of caste. She was the one person who ignored caste, who united Indians as being Indians. These days, we talk about Hindu-Muslim polarization. Those days, that wasn't even an issue. I'll give you another example. In 1971, when the genocide took place in East Pakistan, what was then East Pakistan, over 90 lakh refugees fled to India. They were fleeing from the violence imposed by the Pakistan army. Something like 70 to 80%, the figures vary, of those refugees were Hindus. Can you imagine if that happened today? The BJP would have a field day with talking about Hindu persecution, etc. Mrs. Gandhi never revealed the fact. She called the opposition and they did a deal, and they all agreed they wouldn't mention it because their priority was to avoid communal tension in India. Now, Mrs. Gandhi could have made a big deal out of it, could have won the Hindu vote, could have done something. But Mrs. Gandhi was above those kind of considerations. She was somebody who really believed in India as one united entity. Not everything was perfect. She introduced dynasty at the top levels of Indian politics. She had this idiot son called Sanjay, who was a motor mechanic, and she imposed him on the country, a thug-like character. She imposed him as a sort of successor. He was then removed from the scene by history, but she then brought in the other son. So that, I think, is something we will always have to put down as one of her negative achievements. She also became, I think, during the emergency period, a bit of a megalomaniac. She began to believe that her interests and the interests of India coincided. In fact, the Congress Party slogan then was Indira is India and India is Indira. That is always dangerous when leaders confuse themselves and their own interests with the interests of the nation. So there was a lot of good that Mrs. Gandhi did, but there was a lot of bad.
While you speak about Indira Gandhi, another thing that I would like to recall is, the period between June to December 1984, Blue Star enormous event. We had the Golden Temple incident that took place, followed by Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. In November, I think it was the Sikh massacre, and then unfortunately the Bhopal gas tragedy, which was again an event without any parallel, all in a span of 6 months. Lot of violence and hatred unleashed. Well, it was a remarkable period, and you wrote an article, "Can the Center Hold?" What
Yeah.
did it mean to you, Veer?
Okay, well, look at it this way. Indians were brought up always to believe that Sikhs were patriotic. Hindus always saw Sikhs as being their brothers. In many families in the Punjab, Hindu families, the oldest son would often become a Sikh. The second son would be a Hindu. There was no sense in which these communities had any level of estrangement between them. But in the 1980s, suddenly you have the rise of Sikh militancy. You have Sikhs claiming that they're second-class citizens in India, which astounded most Hindus who'd never thought this was possible. You had massacres where buses were stopped, the Hindu and Sikh passengers were separated, and the Hindus were then shot dead. You had assassinations of popular and influential Hindu figures in the Punjab. The relationship between communities was poisoned beyond repair. You had somebody like Bhindranwale, who, backed by the ISI in Pakistan, was all ready to declare Khalistan as a separate country. He was backed also by NRI Sikhs, who, having gone off to live in Canada or somewhere and were far away from India, safely away from the violence, kept saying things like, we want an independent country. I remember during that period, I went to London, to Southall, to interview a gentleman called Jagjit Singh Chauhan, who was living happily in London, who had a visiting card printed which said Jagjit Singh Chauhan, below it, President, Republic of Khalistan. So it had got to levels that were idiotic and absurd. But were also sad because there was enormous violence, there was enormous hatred within Indian society. The government missed opportunities to try and end this. Bhindranwale, people tend to forget this, was created by Gyani Zail Singh and the Congress Party to take on the Akalis. And like Bin Laden and the CIA, he went out of control and there was no way they could rein him in. They had to take some kind of action against him. There were many opportunities. There was a time when a DIG of the Punjab police called Atwal had gone to the Golden Temple to pray. He was murdered in cold blood and his body lay in the Golden Temple, the forecourt, in the open area because nobody had the guts to remove it. If at that stage you'd sent in the army, there would have been a huge support, even among Sikhs, because nobody agreed with that kind of murder and desecration of the Golden Temple. Mrs. Gandhi waited. And then finally, when it was almost too late, she sent the army in for Operation Blue Star, which you referred to, which was an incredibly badly organized operation. They chose a day, which was the day of martyrdom of Guru. There were lots of innocent pilgrims trapped inside the Golden Temple. The army completely screwed up the operation. Soldiers were mowed down. You don't do this kind of thing as an infantry operation. You do it as a commando operation. And at the end of it, we destroyed the Akal Takht, the holy site in Sikhism, and we badly damaged the Harmandir Sahib, which is the main temple in the Golden Temple. Sikhs all over India were very, very hurt, including people who hadn't liked Bhindranwale, who were against all that the militancy stood for. They felt that the Indian state had attacked the very heart of Sikhism. Now, the irony is that Mrs. Gandhi seemed unaware of this. All her security advisors told her, take Sikhs out of your personal bodyguard. You cannot trust Sikhs. And she said, I am an Indian. Sikhs are Indians. I won't do this. There was one guy, one young guard who seemed particularly surly. And Rajiv Gandhi, who told me this himself later, complained to the guys handling Mrs. Gandhi's security and said, I think this guy, there's a problem. He's beginning to look very rebellious and defiant. Remove him from my mother's security. He was removed. Mrs. Gandhi looked, didn't see him, called a security head and said, where is this guy? So they brought him back. So eventually, when she was killed by Satwant Singh, who was this man, and Beyant Singh, the other guy, it was a great, huge tragedy for India, unthinkable that a prime minister is killed by her own bodyguards. But in some strange way, bizarrely, a tribute to Mrs. Gandhi's nationalism that she'd refused to let her Sikh bodyguards be taken away. The massacres were followed by several days of what we call riots. Sorry, the murder was followed by several days of what we call riots, but were actually massacres. Hindu mobs went out, targeted Sikhs and murdered them in cold blood. They raped their daughters, they raped their sisters, they put tires around them and then set fire to the tires. The level of violence was horrific. The Delhi police melted away. There was no one to protect the Sikhs. It was said, and I think it's probably true, that many Congress leaders, local leaders, encouraged the violence, saying that you guys killed our leader, we will now teach you a lesson. At that stage, as Sikh riots broke out all over India, it seemed unlikely that we would be able to control it. Then, as you say, there was the Bhopal tragedy, which also was a terrible tragedy without precedent. And all of us believed, and certainly the Western press, which had always believed that India could not hold together, believed that this was the beginning of the end, that India would now break up. We forget that during that period, there was also an agitation in Assam, which was possibly secessionist. There were agitations in places like Mizoram, which were 100% secessionist. So the great credit of Rajiv Gandhi when he did take over is that rather than seeking to pursue those vendettas, he decided to play peacemaker. He signed an accord with the Sikhs. He gave them pretty much what they had asked for. He signed an accord with the Mizos. He gave them pretty much what they'd asked for. He ended the Assam agitation. So in that sense, he was a peacemaker and a man who held India together. He certainly had the mandate to do it. But the year before that, it was, I think, the worst year since independence, and it's a miracle we held together.
Great insights that you shared. Actually, the inside story, which none of us were really aware of, Veer. And it's great that you took that time off and efforts to share this with us. I just want to move on to you being in London. You were there, you were born in London.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. What were your views, early views on the Western media? And just a personal question, what made you not still hold on to the British passport?
Oh, yeah, that's like a complicated thing because when people hear that I was born in London, they imagine that my family lived in London, but it didn't. I mean, we lived in India. We always lived in India. My mother went there for a pregnancy because she had a difficult pregnancy. And so I was born in London really by accident.
Yeah, no, so see.
So therefore, it was never really an option for me to live in England. I wanted to come back to India, and I write this in the book. When I was at university, they tried to find me many jobs, international jobs, Hong Kong, jobs in America, jobs in England. But then I had decided I was going to be a journalist. If I was going to be a journalist, I had to write about a country that I cared about. And I don't really care what happens to England or what happens to America. I care about my own country. So I came back to India and became a journalist. And if you are going to come back to India and you are going to make a life in India, writing about India, can you really do it with a foreign passport?
Makes sense. And I also recall I read in the book somewhere that you had gone to Oxford while you were also working for India Today. And you had more than 25 bylines to your credit before entering Oxford. I just want to ask you, what is the importance of the level of thinking that has influenced your writing? You mentioned somewhere, and I quote, "It's not what you write, it's how you think that makes the difference." Go ahead.
Whenever young people ask me, how do I become a good journalist? How do I become a writer? I think we have this misconception in India, probably through years of bad education, that you have to write with big words, long sentences, complex constructions. You have to have quotes from famous people. I don't know if you've ever read anything by Nani Palkhiwala. He was a very famous lawyer in the 70s. I mean, it's a classic example of bad writing. It begins with Jefferson once said, and then goes on to Hegel once said, and Marx once said, and with very long, complicated sentences. That is the kind of writing, sadly, too many of us have been taught to do. Ultimately, writing is not so much about the language you use, though of course it helps to write well and to have good language on your side. Good writing is about organizing. It's about communication. You can only communicate an idea if you've organized it in your own mind. If you know that X follows from Y and then Z follows from that or whatever. If you have all that worked out and you write it, you've probably written a good article. If you've decided you're going to use these quotes and use these big words, you're almost certainly going to write a very bad article.
So let's go back to communication, but leadership this time. And many strong leaders are currently in a situation where they begin to confuse the country with themselves. They think that whatever they have done in their own interest is done for the best interest of the country. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that's always a danger. I think we were very lucky in India that in our formative years, we had Jawaharlal Nehru as Prime Minister, and Jawaharlal Nehru was the builder of modern India. But he was also a man racked with self-doubt, who kept wondering if he was the right leader, if he was doing the right things for India. And because of that, he encouraged dissent. There's a story of Shankar of Shankar's Weekly. He was the leading cartoonist of that time, who went to see Nehru and asked for something. Nehru gave it to him and said, "But don't spare me, Shankar. Keep attacking me." So there was that sense where he encouraged a free press. He encouraged people to criticize him. He was willing to engage in debate. He gave back as good as he got. But there was no sense in which he was above the fray and therefore beyond being criticized. Mrs. Gandhi, his daughter, started out that way. And later during the emergency, I think ended up becoming a megalomaniac. We now have a situation where we are led by somebody who is so committed to his vision of India and really genuinely believes that he has a mission to lead the country and believes genuinely and sincerely that he is above the fray and that everyone else is below him. He's not Jawaharlal Nehru.
Well, another area that intrigues me is that you have a very easygoing relationship with, all those in politics. Who, according to you, has been your toughest public figure to have a conversation with?
Narasimha Rao, because he was very happy off the record, chatting and saying whatever you wanted. But when he went on the record, he treated every interview as a lie detector test. And every time you asked him a question, he would try and avoid it. And then once he ducked it, his whole body would relax and he'd be thrilled that he'd avoided answering your question.
Okay. Well, keeping that in mind, I'm reminded of Amitabh Bachchan. You've closely interacted with him, and you wrote about, how he actually made a colossal mistake for him to join politics. What do you feel was the biggest mistake that he made at one point of time?
I think he should never have joined politics. If you'd seen him in the film industry, and I'd done a cover story for India Today on Amitabh, and I'd spent a long time with him, he never really understood the film industry. He accepted the parts that he understood and ignored the parts that he didn't understand. For instance, and this is in the book, if there was a shift that began at 8 o'clock, in the 8 in the morning, nobody would turn up at 8 o'clock. The director would turn up at 9:30, 10. But Amitabh would always be there at 8 o'clock, despite realizing that nothing would get shot till 10 o'clock, 10:30, because he said, this is how I am. If I give an appointment to somebody, if I accept money to do a shift from 8 to 4, I will be there at 8. So even in that sense, he remained himself proper, well-mannered, unaffected by the industry and all its. And he was very unusual in the industry that he didn't drink, he didn't eat meat. He lived a very austere and quite rigid life. When that kind of person who doesn't even understand the film industry is thrust into politics, which is full of some of the worst and most venal people you can think of in India, there is no way he's going to know how to cope with them. And everybody ran circles around him. I knew him during that period. He was very sincere about his voters in Allahabad. He really cared about them. He did much more for his constituency than most politicians ever do. And yet he was constantly attacked by jealous politicians. He was inveigled into scandals he had nothing to do with. There was no suggestion even that he was involved in Bofors, yet people managed to suggest that he was a recipient of the Bofors payments. And he didn't know where the attacks were coming from. He didn't understand them. He was, I think, completely lost, and therefore a man who had made a huge, huge mistake by entering an arena where he was completely unsuited.
Okay. A last question to go before we start the rapid fire round.
All right.
So, surveillance is part of our political culture. And over the last month, the national media have been abuzz with reports on the Snoop Gate, or I think it's called the Pegasus Gate, as it's been called. The data leaks from India and across the world suggest that thousands of phone lines could have been tracked, some hacked, using the Israeli spyware called Pegasus. What is your take on the Pegasus story?
I think when we talk about Pegasus only in terms of tapping phone lines, we do the scandal a disservice. We do ourselves a disservice because phones have always been tapped in India. The way it works at the moment, your local police commissioner can tap your phone. It doesn't have to be the Intelligence Bureau. It doesn't have to be the Prime Minister. It doesn't have to be anybody. There are just so many authorities empowered with tapping phones that is not a big deal. But all of us believe, perhaps naively, that if you don't talk on a phone line, you talk on WhatsApp, if you talk on Telegram, you're fine. You're not. I mean, the danger with Pegasus is not that it taps your phone, but that it gets into your computer, it gets into your phone. Every bit of data you have, every family photograph, every secret, anything that's in your computer, they have access to. They can open, they can read. They can also then plant information that you have no way of explaining. There have been cases where they've gone into people's computers, planted documents, and then arrested them on sedition charges. And these guys have said, listen, we're not traitors. We don't understand what this is about. I said, look, it's in your computer. How can you deny it? And the courts have actually believed that. And many people have languishing in jail because of this kind of planted information. So Pegasus is important not because of the phone tapping aspect, but because it marks the final end of privacy. Anybody uses Pegasus, like we're on a computer now, but if your phone presumably is lying by your side, guy who uses Pegasus can turn on your phone remotely. He can not only listen to every conversation, he can put on your camera. You will never ever know. You might be alone at home in the evening with, say, your husband. They will be watching you. They will have got control of your camera. That is the danger with Pegasus. Phone tapping is a small part of it. What it really means is that the state has no respect for any privacy of yours. They can control everything.
Okay. Well, I think those are great insights that you shared, and you gave us a different perspective of what we have otherwise seen in the news media. We would like to start by the rapid fire round. And to all our viewers out here, apart from the book that has been released, A Rude Life, Vir Sanghvi is also India's best known food writer and TV host. Rude Food won the Cointreau Award literature book in the world, and his food and travel shows and NDTV Good Times have won numerous awards and continue to be watched by millions. So, food, Veer, if it's fine with you.
Sure.
What is the one place that you dream of eating or?
There's a problem with the audio. I'm not sure I can hear you. Can you ask that again?
Yeah, what is the one place that you dream of eating or dining at?
Oh, my home, always. I mean, because I travel so much, like I'm in Bangalore at the moment, though I live in Delhi, when I come home, that is always my favorite place to sit and eat and have a relaxed evening.
Beautiful. And what is the favorite food you are best at preparing?
I am the world's worst cook. So my favorite food is always prepared by my wife or by somebody else. If I was to cook for you, you'd probably throw up.
Come on. What's your ideal food city?
At the moment, internationally, probably Bangkok or New York. In India, Delhi. I think I've lost your audio again. I can't hear you again. I don't know whether it's me.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you
now.
I can hear you now, and it all goes well, and then suddenly you disappear.
Okay,
but
perfect.
I can still hear you. Let's keep going.
Your favorite gastronomic experience?
Probably eating on the streets in Benares, because we all think we know chaat, but there's such a variety of chaat, so many dishes you've never come across anywhere, which are only made on the streets of Benares, that it opens up a whole new frontier.
Oh, wonderful. So now I want to move from food to yourself, Veer. What is the high point of your career till date?
Oh, I have no idea. As I said, I always don't treat it as peaks and lows. I treat it as a river. I go with the flow. I'm sure there have been very low spots and some high spots, but I don't look back and see it that way at all.
What is the one decision you wish you never took?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Sounds terribly arrogant, but no, I don't really have any regrets.
Okay, I think that's great to live life, the way you choose. Well, after publishing the book, which is the one thing that you felt you wish you had included in it?
Lots, actually, because the book is already quite big and there's quite a lot about my life, about the people I met that I hadn't included, but I couldn't possibly have done it because the book would have got much too huge. Many people have said to me that the book is called A Rude Life. You do a column called Rude Food. How come there's very little food in the book? And that's a valid question, but I think I'm going to have to do another food book because there was no way I could have included that in this one.
If not a TV presenter, a host of a show, an author, a food critic, what is another profession perhaps that you would have ventured out into?
Probably a lawyer. I think the law had always intrigued me, so I would have become a lawyer.
Okay. Who is the one personality you have interviewed who you felt, was really an authentic, exceptional human being and someone you would like to emulate in your life?
The Dalai Lama, without a doubt. Extraordinary human being, so much to learn from him.
Well, death threats is an epidemic, especially targeting India. Have you had any death threats so far in your journalism career?
Yeah, but I mean, are these credible death threats? You get letters and you get people saying things like that, but I'm not sure how seriously to take them. Certainly, my position has always been not to take them seriously.
Okay, a very curious question that I always wanted to ask you. You've been everywhere, you've seen much more than all of us as to what is happening in reality. Have you ever remained a bystander and not spoken up or raised a red flag when you felt that something was genuinely wrong and you could have done something to correct that?
Actually, no, I've always spoken up, and I've always been told by people that I don't need to speak up all the time, that there are times when silence is a wiser course, but that's not in my nature. If I see something unjust or something I object to, something that's damaging India, I speak up.
That's really amazing to hear, Veer, because I think that's like a perfect role model for all of us at the moment. What is the one missed opportunity in your life that you kind of regret?
I don't know. Look, there are at any stage of your life choices. When I finished at Oxford, I could have done many of the jobs that they had suggested, which were very well paid, were glamorous. It was even a job I considered taking, which was working for the music business, first in India and then in Los Angeles. I don't know. Maybe I would have been happier. Maybe it would have been better to have gone down those roads. But I mean, the road not taken is the road best forgotten. I'm happy with the road I took.
Wonderful. And before we end, one last question, Veer. We have 4,500 members from Catholic Club. And, throughout your life, I think there have been real great times where, you've stood up, adventurous moments. What is the one lesson that we can learn from, a strong message that you would like to share with the members of Catholic Club and our viewers today?
Just the simple basic one that whenever you can help people, all too often we help people who helped us, or we help people we want to please, people we think we will get something back from. Don't do that. You never know who will be able to help you anywhere. All of my life, I have benefited from people helping me. No thought for themselves, no thought of what they would get back. So my policy, and this advice I give everyone, is whenever you can, help people. It doesn't matter if you get something back in return, but the fact that you've helped them will at least make you a better human being.
Vir Sanghvi, thank you for chronicling our times. From all our viewers, to all our viewers out here, please do pick up a copy of the book today. It will be available at Catholic Club Library shortly. Whether you are into politics or not, it does not make a difference, because this book gives insights of a newer India. Vir Sanghvi, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Thank you.
Wonderful. And now we'll open up the floor for any questions from our audience. For all those who would like to ask, kindly unmute yourself and have a go at it. We have a few minutes left.
Hi, Mr. Sanghvi. This is Naomi. I have two questions for you. One is, what is your comfort food? And secondly, what's your formula, if you could tell us, writing a bestseller?
Well, yeah, but this book is a bestseller, and I'm very grateful for the fact that it's the #1 bestseller in India. But there is no formula. I've written about my life. There is no way I can do another book like this because I have only one life to live. So if I had a formula, I would keep churning out bestsellers. This one, no. I mean, it's my life, and I'm very grateful and gratified that people have liked it and loved it so much to make it the #1 bestseller. But it's the only book of its kind that unfortunately I can write. As to my comfort food, I always get into trouble because people expect me to say dal, chawal, and khichdi and all that. It's not. It's good steak, medium rare, crisp French fries, a little béarnaise sauce on the side, and a glass of red wine. Not the sort of thing we can get much of in India these days.
I always came across people saying, ma ke haath.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a cliche answer. No, my mother used to make such good food, and no matter which restaurant I go to, I long for her cooking. Well, actually, no, I don't. I long for steak and chips.
Hi, sir. This is Rohini De Silva. You have been coming to a regular visitor to Bangalore since 1983, and I'm sure you've seen it transform. Like, what are your go-to places for when you visit Bangalore?
You mean restaurants and places like that? Yeah, I don't know.
Or restaurants or anything, like any place that you must visit, like sort of try to visit.
So much. I came to Bangalore not in 83. I came to Bangalore for the first time in 1976. And it was this very sleepy, I was very young then, but it was a very sleepy small town. And I fell in love with it almost immediately. I had a friend who lived in the ITC apartments, which ironically would then pull down and turn into the Gardenia Hotel where I am now and I'm speaking to you from. That Bangalore sadly has vanished and disappeared. It was a very, very different Bangalore. It was a gentler Bangalore. It had lots of greenery. The people were even nicer, more polite. It was sleepy. And then came this whole tech boom. And that around 83, 84, which you correctly say, is when I started coming back to Bangalore more often. I could see it changing. And I always worried whether the change would, somehow alter the character of Bangalore. And it has. But I mean, who am I as an outsider to say whether the change is for the good or the change is for the bad? Bangalore is a much more cosmopolitan city. It's much more the center of the action. People are much better paid. So yeah, I mean, I assume the change is good. But I've gone to many, many places at many, many different times. For many years, I stayed at the West End Hotel in Bangalore, which must be one of the world's finest and most beautiful hotels. And it seemed to me to sum up old Bangalore, whereas the Gardenia, which I always stay at now, seems to me to sum up new Bangalore, the city and what it's become, the sort of center of the action kind of city. In terms of restaurants and food, the South Indian food in Bangalore has always been good. And it's been good because though in North India, we think of South Indian food as being one great homogeneous mess, we forget the things like the dosa, the idli, which are always the best in Bangalore, were actually popularized by people from Karnataka who took it to the rest of India, not by Tamilians, which is what Punjabis and everybody in India thinks this food is. So yes, I've always liked the local food. I was introduced in the 1980s in Bangalore to Andhra food, which I had never had before at restaurants like Amravati. I don't even know if that still exists. And I fell in love with Andhra food. And I thought that was going to be the wave of the future. I was wrong. I also was introduced, I had my first appam in Bangalore in 1982. So Bangalore for me has always been the gateway to the many cuisines of the South. I remember the Karavalli restaurant at the Taj Gateway. When it opened, it was probably the first Indian restaurant at a hotel not to serve a roti, where you had to eat an appam or you had to have a neer dosa or you had to have rice. It was genuinely, authentically South Indian coastal food. Everybody said it would close down. It didn't close down. It's now one of India's best restaurants. So Bangalore for me has always been, despite the changes and despite perhaps the loss of one old character, it's been a city at the forefront of everything. I remember the 1980s, I don't know if it still exists, there used to be this export reject shop called Warehouse, which made quite expensive clothes available at throwaway prices because of export clothes, and changed the way I dress, changed the way that many Indians dress. So Bangalore has been a very important city in my life.
Thank you.
Well, we now move on to questions from the audience. Is there anyone who would like to ask any other question? Please go ahead.
I would like to ask a question to you, Vir Sanghvi. Since you said you like steaks, have you tasted the steaks from Portland in Bangalore?
Yeah, until recently, Portland was actually my favorite place in Bangalore.
Oh,
I know the
okay.
owners. I know the owners. I know their commitment to quality. And I used to always go there for steaks.
Thank you.
I think my question you already answered, right? What's the biggest lesson you've learned in life? Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. I'll answer it again if you like. The biggest lesson I've learned in life is that nothing is permanent, nothing lasts. That never get arrogant, never believe that your success or your fame or your money is going to last. It may not. The essential thing to remember in life is that it's fragile. All the things that happen to you may happen, may not happen, may last, may not last. Never build your sense of self, never build your sense of happiness on achievements and saying, I'm so successful, I'm so famous, I'm so rich, I've done so well in my career. That's not what's important. Base yourself, your sense of self, base your happiness on your personal life, on your friends, on your family, and the kind of human being you are. That is within your control, and that will last.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really nice.
A quick question. Actually, I'm very curious about that line of curios behind you.
Which one?
Just turn around and you have a line of curios behind you. Okay, actually, let me not waste your time on that because I realized you're staying at a hotel. I thought you were at home.
Credit for whatever is there goes to ITC. It has nothing to do with me.
Yeah, okay. Got that. So your book talks a lot about your personal and professional experiences in life.
Yeah.
But you're still quite a private person. How do you manage to draw that distinction?
By not writing about it, by not talking about it. It's not always easy, but generally, if you don't talk about your private life, you don't talk about your personal life, sometimes people can persist, but most people just give up and they realize you're not going to talk about it.
That must be tough to do.
I would like to ask a question.
I think you have the gift.
Thank you.
Yes, I would like to ask a question. Ms. Sanghvi, since you've eaten food from almost, I think, every part of India, which colloquial cuisine do you feel is the best or which you like the most?
Oh, the best cuisine in India is the cuisine of Kerala, because it is a state where there are so many different communities living, at least so far, though this is also fragile, in harmony. You have the Muslims who came very early, before the Muslims came to the north, as traders along the coast. You have the Christians who came in many different waves. You have the Syrian Christians who were here, shortly after the birth of Jesus Christ. You have the Latin Christians, the Catholics, all of their kind of food. You have the Hindus. Even within the Hindus, north and south is different. In my view, great food comes about not from one community, but from the intermingling of communities when they eat each other's food and they use it to improve their own food.
So when the state is a cultural melting pot, you're trying to say that the best food comes from those regions.
That is what I'm trying to say indeed, yes.
Auntie Tessa, Kerala.
Yeah.
Rego, Kerala. Sorry.
Vir Sanghvi, have you tasted the Mangalorean cuisines, Mangalorean food?
Yes. I've shot a program in Bangalore, I've shot a program in Udupi. I've been all over eating the food.
Okay, so we have a lot of members, Mangalorean members in the Catholic Club. So could you tell us your favorite food?
In
Mangalorean food.
I don't have any one dish in any cuisine generally. What I like about Mangalorean food, I mean, everybody goes on and on about the fish, and all over Bombay, you will find people from Mangalore who run restaurants and they keep selling you giant crabs, which you don't actually find in Mangalore. These are farmed crabs. That doesn't impress me so much. What impresses me about Mangalorean food is the mastery of masalas. It's actually quite complex flavors, quite complex masalas compared to the rest of India. And you don't actually get that outside, even at so-called Mangalorean restaurants outside of Mangalore. You have to go to Mangalore, have the freshly ground masalas done by people who have family recipes. And that's what makes it one of India's best cuisines.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mr. Sanghvi, would you like to share any of your present endeavors or what are your future plans?
Gosh, no, I don't. I'm not the kind of person who makes plans. As will be clear from the book, that life is just something that's happened to me. I've never had any great designs or plans. I'm doing a variety of things at the moment. I'm chairman of a company called Culinary Culture, which brings great chefs to India and also will rate restaurants in India on an all India basis, like say Michelin abroad. That endeavor has come to a bit of a halt or hit a speed bump because of the pandemic. Hopefully that will be over and we can proceed with that. I have a food column in the Hindustan Times. I have a political column in the Hindustan Times. I have a column in Business Standard, which in fact appeared today. I also appear on television. At the moment, I'm between television shows, but I imagine I will start another one fairly soon.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
All done?
Yeah. Tessa, may I request you to go ahead with the vote of thanks? Yeah.
What a session. This book is not just a personal recount of Mr. Vir Sanghvi, it's also about politics and much, much more. I'm sure after reading this book, we would all take a rethink or a look back at certain events that have happened in the past. This book also is a reminder that lives are intertwined with tragedy and comedy, and we do need to rise above them. I would also like to add, Mr. Vir Sanghvi, that your writing skill makes this book an absolute page turner and a joy to read. So on behalf of Catholic Club, we would like to thank you for accepting our invitation to join us today. And we'd also thank all our members and viewers for joining us on this wonderful session. Thank you once again.
Thank you for inviting me. It's really been a very enjoyable session.
Thank you, Vir, and we wish you all the very best from all of us here at Catholic Club.
Thank you, Samira. Well, good afternoon to all of you. And thank you for listening. It's been a really I'm honored. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.